Welcome to Mano a Mano, U.S. Puerto Rico, Journey Toward a More Perfect Union.
A podcast amplifying the voices of leaders, thinkers, activists, and allies from across the political spectrum who support Puerto Rico's fight for full democracy and self-determination.
I'm your host, George Laws Garcia, Executive Director for the Puerto Rico Statehood Council, joined by
Rivera, Director of Advocacy for the Puerto Rico Statehood Council.
Well, as we start the new year, we want to take a step back. In episode 1, we had a great conversation with the governor of Puerto Rico, Pedro Pierluisi.
Puerto Ricans, particularly the ones who reside in Puerto Rico, is that we are bluntly discriminated.
In this episode, we want to focus on providing some context on all of the things that have happened in the most recent years to advance the Puerto Rico statehood movement and the issue of resolving Puerto Rico's status. We want to talk about where we are in the movement right now during this session of Congress, what's happening, and all of the challenges and the opportunities that we have to move this issue forward.
Now, let's begin the show.
So, Martin, this issue's been around for 125 years. Why have the last few years, in your view, marked a turning point where this issue now really has momentum towards getting resolved?
Well, I think in the last few years, something that's happened is just clarification of what Puerto Rico is. Like the Supreme Court definitely clarified once and for all that Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory. Congress can discriminate upon the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico merely for residing on the island because it's a territory. That means that basically we don't have equal benefits, equal rights. The Constitution doesn't apply equally to us. And even let's say that Congress were to give Puerto Rico the same benefits and the same rights as a territory, any future Congress can strip away those rights. Over the last decade, the voters in Puerto Rico have clearly stated that they do not want to remain in the current territory status, and they have chosen statehood time and time again as their preferred option. So I feel that has led to legislative progress. Most recently, the 2020 plebiscite clearly showed a majority of Puerto Ricans choosing statehood and wanting to leave the territory status. That led to two proposals being introduced in Congress, in the 117th Congress. That was the Self-Determination Act and the Statehood Admission Act. The goal of those bills were to move outside of the territorial clause, to seek sovereignty. That was the goal overall. But obviously, after those two legislative hearings, it became clear that both bills were in an impasse. So after, I believe, close to a year of negotiations, followed where the resident commissioner and other Puerto Rican members and leadership in the House got together to find the best path forward. And again, this bill's a compromise, so it's not what each side would have 100% would have liked, but it came to this consensus bill that, one, before introduction, it was open to the public to provide input. Then they had a whole forum in Puerto Rico in Spanish so that the citizens of Puerto Rico can actually provide their input as well prior to introduction. And once the bill was introduced, it went to the committee markup. And despite steep opposition and pessimism that anything was going to happen, the House managed to pass the bill with strong bipartisan support. That, again, is historic because, again, the House has passed 3 pieces of legislation dealing with Puerto Rico status since 1998. But this is the first time that it's a binding offer of statehood to the citizens of Puerto Rico, and whatever Puerto Rico chooses, that's what will become, again, if the bill becomes law.
Well, I think what's remarkable about what happened in the last session of Congress is that the members of Congress that are really interested in this issue and working on it, which are representing Puerto Rico, our resident commissioner, Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, who is a member of the Republican conference. And then on the Democratic side, the lead person focusing on this was Nidhi Velasquez, who represents New York. She doesn't represent a single voter in Puerto Rico, but being Puerto Rican herself has really basically kind of carved out a position where she's looked at by a lot of her Democratic colleagues as kind of a go-to person on Puerto Rico issues. And Ms. Velasquez has been in the past a supporter of maintaining Puerto Rico under the current territory status. And I think because of what you mentioned of the Supreme Court cases in 2016, where, the Supreme Court basically confirmed Puerto Rico is a territory. As a territory, it's subject to the plenary powers of Congress. And then, later that year in 2016, we also had the passage of Promesa, which is a legislation that basically took Puerto Rico's local self-government and subordinated it to a board of non-elected officials that can basically make governing decisions over the people of Puerto Rico. And that really shifted the dynamic for Velasquez, where she realized there's no future in Puerto Rico continuing to remain territory, and we have to look for non-territorial options.
And in fact, I'm glad you mentioned this because to go back to the two legislative hearings, this issue actually came up in the legislative hearings and in the committee markup, where a member of the Republican Party who opposed the legislation, he actually asked directly to Velasquez, like, "Hey, you've supported whatever options are given to Puerto Rico in the future, the current status, el Estado Libre Asociado, has to be an option." And she emphatically said, "Yeah, I used to believe that. You know what changed my mind? Vallejo Madero, a Supreme Court decision that clearly defined that as long as we remain in the territorial status, the citizens of Puerto Rico would not attain equality. And any advancements, any band-aids to the wound of the inequality the territory status gives, such as extending transitioning from NAP to SNAP, giving the child tax credit, which are all great things that need to happen. That, again, is just a Band-Aid on the gaping wound of the inequality and disenfranchisement that the current territory status provides."
And that's really because at any point, as long as you're a territory, any of those advances that are made legislatively in Congress can be clawed back. Whereas once you become a state, those things become permanent. You have the same treatment as any other state in the country. And that's why we support statehood. But I think going back to kind of the narrative of what's happened over these past couple of years, just that development of the fact that right now in Congress, there isn't a single member of Congress that, and either side of the aisle, that is actively advocating in support of continuing the current territory status. That's really significant. And that signals a huge shift from where this debate was, 10, 20, 30 years ago, and shows the progress that's been made. There is an emerging consensus in Congress that the best options for Puerto Rico are non-territorial options. And, last year's process of developing the compromise legislation, the Puerto Rico Status Act, revealed that there is bipartisan support for providing a legislative process, even if the members have different preferences for what they would actually prefer for Puerto Rico's future, where Jennifer Gonzalez, Darren Soto, and members like Steny Hoyer was a member of leadership at the time. They clearly prefer statehood for Puerto Rico. And, Nydia Velasquez and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bob Menendez, which are some of the leaders on the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act, they clearly don't support statehood for Puerto Rico, and may be open to sovereignty and free association or independence or other non-territory options. But it's fascinating that we're at least now in a point where the non-territory options are the ones that are winning the debate, and where we can't necessarily yet say that there's a consensus in Congress about which option should be the one for Puerto Rico's future. There's at least a consensus that it should be a non-territory option, and that we have an opportunity to advance the legislative process that allows voters in Puerto Rico the option to decide. Can you just tell us real quick, what are the non-territory options that this legislation presents?
Right. So basically, again, the goal of the bills is to give Puerto Rico sovereignty once and for all. There's two ways to achieve sovereignty. That's either through statehood or through becoming an independent nation with or without a compact of free association. Those exist. We have examples in the world. There's Micronesia, Palau, and the Marshall Islands. The U.S. has a compact of free association with them, but they are independent nations in of themselves. That's how they attained sovereignty. The other option is like full-on independence. We don't have any compacts. We don't have treaties. Puerto Rico goes on its own. Again, clean cut, and then full equality. If Puerto Rico chooses to remain as part of the United States to attain sovereignty and attain full equality, the only option is statehood. Because under the current territory status, nothing is guaranteed because you are a colony, you're a territory. and that allows Congress and the federal government to disenfranchise and discriminate against the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico. That's why there's only, I would call it 2.5 options.
Yeah.
Statehood, independence, and independence with or without a compact of free association.
So, Martin, I think that that's amazing because this bill basically committed, Congress is committing to implementing these options based on the choice of voters in Puerto Rico. And that's historic. So we were able to get this bill passed in the House December of 2022. And it was right at the end of that session.
1 week left in the Congress after that passage.
And of course, the Senate didn't really have time to take action. So here we are looking into the current session of Congress. Democrats lost control. Republicans regained the House. It's been a very messy year in Congress for sure. That's an understatement. Yeah, right. But I think it's really important to give our listeners a sense of, what we've been able to achieve this, past year to continue moving this issue forward. And then maybe we can talk a little bit about what we want to do next and the opportunities that we're seeing for the remainder of this year.
Well, right off of the bat, the one thing that happened was the reintroduction of the Puerto Rico Status Act in the House. Currently, it has 92 co-sponsors, 90 Democrats, and 12 Republicans, which is quite an achievement given the divides in the House, and also the reason why because I believe it was 15 or 16 last Congress
that voted for it
for the bill. Yep. Some members retired, so having 12 this Congress shows still the ongoing bipartisan support for the bill. Obviously, we're pushing to have a hearing in the House as well. That's one of our goals, either on the bill or on the issue in general. But one big historic achievement was the introduction of the Puerto Rico Status Act in the Senate by Senator Martin Heinrich. That has a historic support of 22 other senators as leading co-sponsors on the bill. That's, I believe, the largest number of co-sponsors on any Puerto Rico status bill
in history.
In history.
Yeah.
So that shows the ongoing momentum, and it took some time. Obviously, as George mentioned, there's some divides this Congress, and that has carried over also to the Senate. But the wheels of progress keep moving forward. Besides the pessimism that nothing's going to happen on this issue, that I like to call the naysayers that stamp down any step towards actually achieving full equality, the wheels are turning. We're moving forward. The next legislative step is to have a hearing. After that is having a markup on the bill, and then we can see if the bill can stand alone as a standalone bill or actually be put into another legislative package that could make it be enacted into law. At the end of the day, what I believe we've been pushing forward, and a lot of statehood activists, are that we realize that the wheels of progress sometimes move slowly, but they're moving forward.
Yeah.
And they're moving towards full equality for the people of Puerto Rico and for the citizens of Puerto Rico to finally choose their political future.
Yeah. And, I couldn't agree with that more, but I think we really need to look at the introduction of the Senate companion bill, the Puerto Rico Status Act, and just recognize just how significant that is, right? So we have the House bill that was reintroduced again by Congressman Grijalva, along with the support of Nidia Velasquez, but also Jennifer Gonzalez. That's bipartisan, is great. And we already had that pass the House during the last session. In this session, we're facing different House leadership and House majority. So, it's a little bit more challenging to get attention on these issues. It's a little bit more challenging to get attention on any issue. So it's no surprise that, it's been a little bit slower moving on that front. But really, the place where the issue needed to move the most is the United States Senate, because that's the body that in the last 10 years really hasn't taken, any other action, right? So we've had the House pass legislation on this issue in 1998, in 2010, and then again now in 2022. But not once has the Senate actually passed, a standalone bill on this issue. So the fact that now we have a bill that got introduced last November, and that the bill came in with the largest amount of support that any bill on this issue has ever had in the Senate, that's huge. That's real progress. We have almost a quarter of the United States Senate saying, hey, this is an issue that needs to be addressed, and that this is a piece of legislation that sets out a framework that is a starting point for us to, advance the legislative process.
Right, and I was mistaken. You said the last in 2010 was when one of the bills was passed by the House, but in 2013 was the last time that the Senate actually even held a hearing on solely the issue of the island status. And that's something that hasn't happened because there's been several hearings on the territories in general or in Puerto Rico in general. And there are several different issues such as energy, housing, disaster relief that suck up a lot of the time in these hearings. And again, it's been over a decade since the Senate has even addressed this issue.
And that's why I think that, as you mentioned, the real big opportunity that we have during this year and the really big push is the opportunity to have the U.S. Senate hold a hearing on this issue. It's been a decade since the last time that they did it. And the committee that has the opportunity to do that is the Senate Energy Natural Resources Committee, which is right now being led by Chairman Joe Manchin, who just recently announced that he'll be retiring from Congress. So we think that, that's a huge opportunity because Senator Manchin doesn't have any things that would limit him or hold him back from being able to do that. And now he's got 22 of his colleagues telling him, hey, this is important. We care about this. Please do this. And having a hearing is going to be really critical to getting a broader cross segment of the U.S. Senate informed about this issue and in taking us forward in the legislative process so that we can advance and open up opportunities to move the issue forward.
And one thing you didn't mention is the lead sponsor of the bill in the Senate is Martin Heinrich, who sits on the Committee of Jurisdiction, which that helps as well. And some of the other original co-sponsors are either on the committee or are subcommittee chairs. So it shows that already within the Committee of Jurisdiction, there is interest on moving this issue forward. So again, the wheels of progress move slowly, but they keep moving forward, and that's what we're going to keep doing.
So there's another element that I think is absolutely critical to mention about the progress that the statehood movement has done and the movement to resolve this issue. And it has to do with grassroots activism and the fact that this is no longer an issue that is just being led by elected officials and politicians. In past decades, it was mostly the governors and the resident commissioners and politicians that would come to Washington and try to move this issue forward. But what we've seen and what you and I have been a part of as, the leadership of the Puerto Rico Statehood Council, but also as participants in the Puerto Rico Statehood Action Network, which is a grassroots nationwide network of individual U.S. Citizens that support statehood for Puerto Rico. And we have people who are on the island and throughout the states that are coming together to, do grassroots activism around this. What we've seen is a huge surgence of young people, women, veterans, Democrats, Republicans, a number of different groups and individuals coming together to write letters, come to Washington, D.C. to visit their members of Congress.
Which is not an easy thing coming from the island. And again, it's an expense for those activists that we have them nationwide, but those that are from the island that have to make the trip over here, find lodging, they do that expense just because they know this is the right thing for their people. So sorry to interrupt, but
No, and that's super important because it just shows the level of commitment that these activists have. And they, I've seen several of them that haven't just come once or twice. They've come 3, 4, 5 times. And, we have that also as an asset because the more frequently they've been able to take that level of activism, the more they've seen that their actions are actually making a difference. You have staffers that are better informed about this issue. You have members of Congress that are more aware that this is an issue that's moving forward. And of course, with the stateside supporters, a lot of them are also voters in their own states. So elected, officials who are running for re-election are also becoming aware that this issue is not just, an important issue to do for the political, for the policy importance of it, but it also has political consequences.
Again, one one fact is in regards to the Puerto Rican population on the island and nationwide is there's 3.2 million U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico, but majority of Puerto Ricans actually live stateside. 5.8, closer to 6 million Puerto Ricans live stateside. That's in Florida, New York, Texas, Pennsylvania, Michigan. I have family living in Colorado. That shows you that one, it shows how we are already interwoven into American society, but it also shows how the issue of our people, because besides leaving Puerto Rico and coming stateside, the island stays close to us. It's a part of us. And not resolving the inequality on the island impacts how we vote, not just in Puerto Rico, but also stateside, in those critical battleground states that are so critical for any federal candidate seeking any federal office. And again, if you don't see the needs or the demands for equality coming from your community, you're doing it as a candidate on your own detriment.
Yeah.
And right now, just to say, like, again, I was raised in Florida. I was born in Puerto Rico, raised in Puerto Rico, but then I was raised majority of my life in Florida. Right now, there's Senate races, down ballot House races to have control of the chamber, and obviously that's so important. But even on the presidential ballot, we have the two candidates right now that their residence is Florida.
Yeah.
So, and that state, I believe it's the second largest, if not the largest, population of Latinos. It's Puerto Ricans in Florida. And again,
about a million, right?
Yeah. You disregard their needs at your own detriment and the detriment of your own campaign. If you don't think this issue is critical going forward to get the vote of the Puerto Rican electorate.
So I think that pretty much takes us right into our, final segment to really talk about the challenges, but also the opportunities that there are to move this issue forward in 2024, and why it's so important for the listeners and our supporters to get more active and more involved now. And, I think the first factor in terms of both challenges and opportunities is the U.S. federal election, right? So, around the country, we're going to have our election. The presidential election has already begun to have this issue be a part of the mix of issues that are being addressed. We've seen that on the GOP side. With some comments that have been, put forward by some candidates. We also know on the Democratic side that the Biden administration officially endorsed the Puerto Rico Status Act when the bill came up for a vote in December 2022 by issuing a statement of administration policy. So they've pretty much, put their official position of where they stand. They are officially taking a position of supporting the right of the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico to decide their future and have Congress implement and enact whatever it is that the people in Puerto Rico decide. So that's significant. And now what we're seeing is the opportunity of stateside voters to reach out to the political candidates as well as the elected officials to say, hey, we care about Puerto Rico. We care about the future of American democracy. And we want to know what your position is with regards to this issue of resolving Puerto Rico's territory status.
And one thing just to add on to that is that some people forget, like Puerto Ricans, even though they're U.S. citizens, they don't vote in the presidential, in federal elections. But they do vote in the presidential primary.
Exactly.
And those are coming up. And again, not just to focus on the Puerto Ricans that live stateside, which obviously you want to make sure your constituents are with you going forward, but for those presidential candidates that are running to get the nomination, Puerto Rico votes on the primary cycle. So again, another issue to have in their considerations going forward. Why, again, they're electing their duties to oversee the needs of the Puerto Rican population, not just in their communities as their constituents, but also in their duties of ensuring that all U.S. citizens have equality. You're doing it to your own detriment of your own political aspirations, and also you're not helping your constituents, which that's what you were elected to do.
Yeah, definitely. So I think one of the things that's interesting about this is that aside from the participation of Puerto Ricans on the island in the presidential primaries, you also have a factor of the connection of Puerto Ricans on the island with the approximately 6 million Puerto Ricans that live stateside, and I think that that's something that elected officials and candidates who really want to be able to speak to those voters that are stateside, that are part of the Puerto Rican community, that they can appeal to them by expressing an openness to address this issue and interest in it. And whereas a lot of the mainstream political analysis really thinks about this issue as, well, if Puerto Rico becomes a state, it's automatically going to elect, all Democrats. The reality on the island is actually more complex than that. And this kind of is a perfect segue into the second factor of both, challenges and opportunities for 2024, which is the Puerto Rico general election. And the Puerto Rico general election right now has a situation where the governor of Puerto Rico, Pedro Pierluisi, who interviewed in the last episode, is actually running in a primary against Puerto Rico's sole member of Congress, Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, who is a Republican at the national level. In Puerto Rico, they both belong to the same party, which supports statehood. But nationally, Pedro Pierluisi is a Democrat and Jennifer Gonzalez is a Republican. And what this shows you is that the two most competitive candidates for the governorship in Puerto Rico are actually aligning themselves with the political parties at the national level. And the Puerto Rican electorate is being more and more exposed to the national political agendas and beginning to realign itself in a way that is reflective of the national political debate of, left and right and conservative and liberal and Democrat and Republican, as opposed to the way that the politics in Puerto Rico has been held for the last 125 years, which has been mostly along the lines of whether or not you support statehood, independence, or continuing with the current territory status.
And you hit the nail on the head, because that's something that's a misconception up here in D.C., that Puerto Rico will be automatically a Dem state or a Republican state. It's in my opinion, Puerto Rico is more of a swing state. It has elected Republicans in the past. It has, I believe, in their last legislature, they had the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate were both Republicans, Republican governors. In the past, I know you worked for Luis Fortuño at one point, which again it's a Republican governor. You worked for Pierluisi, a Democrat governor.
Exactly.
And like you mentioned, the current race is a reflection of national politics seeping into the Puerto Rican electorate. That shows that it does make odd bedfellows, because obviously the traditional parties have been on the status option, but in the Popular Party and the Independence Party, you can find also a broad spectrum that also reflects how national politics, how Puerto Ricans are interwoven into national politics, into these national issues. The issue is that we don't have a voice in the chambers that matter, that actually makes the choices on these critical issues. But what's going to happen in this local in the general election in Puerto Rico is it's important to highlight that, again, there's a primary in
June.
In June,
yeah,
between the governor and the resident commissioner. The goal is that whoever wins, because they're both strong advocates for statehood. So we hope that the movement continues going forward, and that doesn't have a repercussions here, basically. But basically, just keeping up the support and the partnership, and the goal that whoever wins, the goal is to achieve equality for the constituents, for their constituents in Puerto Rico.
So if I can kind of put a finer point on this, I think one of the challenges for the statehood movement is that the two top elected officials, Pedro Pierluisi and Jennifer Gonzalez, that are both supporters of statehood for Puerto Rico and have been incredibly powerful advocates. And as Martín mentioned, I didn't mention this in the previous episode, but I worked for Pedro Pierluisi, and I have a great deal of respect for his work and the work that his team is doing right now. But we've also, collaborated very closely with the Office of the Resident Commissioner, and we did so throughout the entire process of advocating for the passage of the Puerto Rico Status Act in the last session of Congress.
And in my personal experience with working with, and again, I'm a Democrat, but I've worked with the resident commissioner's office when I was working in Congress. I used to work for Congressman Darren Soto from Florida. When I worked at PRAFA, I worked with her office hand in hand on the issues of status, and that's the thing that that's why I have hope, regardless of what happens in the primary. I've seen this issue cross partisan lines time and time again, because at the end of the day, whether you're a Democrat, you're a Republican, conservative, liberal, progressive, whatever you see, you can see that as Puerto Ricans, either stateside or on the island, we want to achieve full equality for our people once and for all. After 125 years, and we're getting close to the 107th anniversary of U.S. citizenship being granted to Puerto Ricans, we can all agree that we need to move past the territorial status, the colonial territorial status, and give our people full equality through either statehood or independence. But if you're going to stay as you want to be part of the United States, the only option that guarantees your full rights, it's statehood.
Yeah. And you know what? That's not the perspective that everyone in Puerto Rico shares, which is also, I think, one of the both challenges and opportunities that there are right now. So the Popular Democratic Party, who's supported the current territory status, they've been on a steep decline in these past several electoral cycles. Right now, it's not looking like they have a very strong set of candidates going into the race for governor or resident commissioner. So probability of them having electoral success, I think, is fairly limited. But the one factor which is definitely new is an emerging alliance between Puerto Rico's Independence Party and a progressive left-wing union-backed party called the Citizens Victory Movement. And this alliance, I think, is trying to promote a vision of Puerto Rico as a separate country, right? They're looking at the issue of capitalizing on the insatisfaction that voters on the island have had with the two main traditional parties, which have been the pro-statehood party and the Popular Democratic Party, and trying to say, hey, we can do something new, and we're going to build a new nation, right? Nueva Patria is the way that they call it. And in reality, what they're not telling their supporters is that, you know, they're basically supporting independence, because even the party of the Citizens Victory Movement that is, you know, officially agnostic with regards to what status option they prefer, they're basically backing a gubernatorial candidate, which is not only pro-independence, but is someone who has been, you know, allied with, and his party has been extensively allied with, you know, hardcore left-wing, you know, socialist elected officials in other countries, including Venezuela, in the figure of Nicolás Maduro, in Daniel Ortega, the president of Nicaragua, and other figures throughout Latin America. So, you know, when you're aligning yourself with that, that's basically, you know, showing your cards as to what you actually want to bring to Puerto Rico. It's not a neutral position that they're taking. They're basically trying to, you know, pretend that, you know, they're just supporting Puerto Rico renovating itself and, you know, trying to be anti-corruption. But in reality, they're trying to bring a whole nother agenda that's completely different from the consensus that has happened in Puerto Rico politics for the last several decades, which is that the majority of people in Puerto Rico, the vast majority, want to retain their U.S. citizenship, want to continue being a part of the United States, want to continue having the opportunity to travel freely back and forth between Puerto Rico and the island, and who believe in, you know, the right to private property and to economic freedom, you know?
And if I can just, it's to me apparent, it's a bit of weakness in the so-called alliance, because it shows that, because traditionally they've run on independence, like at least the PIP party, obviously, clearly, and right now they know that they don't have that support. But what, even from the last election, what they like to do is kind of like muddy up the waters and say, well, if you count these people here and these people here, in reality, then the Independence Party got 25% of the vote. And it's like, no, that's not how that works. And that's how they were trying to, I like to call it the Dragon Ball Z fusion dance they were trying to do in Puerto Rico, and try to combine the Movimiento Victoria and the PIP party. And the Supreme Court of Puerto Rico said, no, you can't do that on the ballot. You can do staggered, like which is what they're doing now. But like you mentioned, when you go to a Movimiento Victoria person, and let's say even somebody who supports statehood in the Movimiento Victoria, that when you ask them directly, so what's your preferred status? Some will say I prefer statehood, but you're still supporting the guy who's adamantly against any other option except independence. And then when you ask people who lean more towards independence, they say, "Oh, we don't want to talk about the status. We don't want to talk about that. Let's talk about other issues." But it's again, you don't want to talk about the gaping wound. You want to just speak about how to put band-aids on that gaping wound. That it's the status issue. That's why there's so much inequality in Puerto Rico. Yeah, there are things that you still have to deal with at the state level. That's why you have a state legislature. But there are things that a state or a territory cannot handle by itself.
Of course.
That's why you have the federal government. That's why if Puerto Rico were to become state, it would have those full rights. Or if Puerto Rico wants to become independent, that's a legitimate option. It's not my preferred option. I don't think it's the best choice for Puerto Rico, but it's an option nonetheless. Where to do it because again, like I mentioned earlier, there are independent nations with compacts of free association that are still dependent on the U.S. because right now we just went through
compact renewal process.
Yeah, it was in the last NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, and
it still hasn't passed. It's still pending, right?
It's still pending, and then the issue is that, like again, free association doesn't give you the guarantee of the full equality or that the needs of Puerto Rico's constituents will be met, because that's the whole point of free association. It's an agreement between two parties that anybody could leave at any point. But when it just to come back to the local parties, to me, them trying to do the fusion dance, basically, that to me shows weakness, that neither party could stand on its own 2 feet. But again, it's something to discuss. But dodging the issue of status, to me, shows the weakness and how they're trying to put a veil over Puerto Rico's voters as to where they actually stand on the most critical issue going forward. And if I may add a little bit on the Partido Popular, the Popular Party, it's funny that they seem to be stuck in the last century.
Yep.
Like, originally, the thing that I find so ironic, because even Dalmau, Senator Dalmau, like, and several populares supported the Self-Determination Act, right? That was the path forward, right? According to them. That bill emphatically said that any options going forward should be outside of the territorial clause, that the territory status, el Estado Libre Asociado, shouldn't go forward. So it's very hypocritical of them now saying that the current status needs to be up there or be an option for the future of Puerto Rico, when the Puerto Rico's voters have rejected the current status time and time again over the last decade.
But that hypocrisy is clearly rooted in the fact that their political franchise is completely dependent on the continuation of the current territory status, and irrespective of how much damage the current territory status and the inequality that's tied to it and political subordination that's tied to it imparts on the voters and the population in Puerto Rico, they want to continue pushing that forward, because otherwise their party goes kaput. And that just shows you the type of values that you're dealing with in that case. And just to put a kind of closing statement on the issue of the alliance between the Independence Party and the Citizens Victory Movement, MVC, I think the biggest challenge there is for voters in Puerto Rico to actually discern if someone is selling you something, but they're not really telling you what it is that you are actually buying. Can you trust that? Do they have your best interests at heart? And, my humble opinion, at this point in Puerto Rico's history, we don't need anyone selling us snake oil anymore. We need to know what it is that we are choosing. And, that informed consent is the only way to actually have a clear basis for deciding where we want Puerto Rico's future to go. And that's where I think the greatest opportunity is. We have legislation right now in Congress that offers a clear choice. Is the bill perfect? No. Is there room to improve it? Yes. But does it offer a clear choice to voters? Definitely. So it is a great, great opportunity for advancing this in this Congress by, having these hearings, maybe possibly even having the opportunity for a markup, possibly even finding a way to adding it to some other piece of legislation that, is a must-pass bill. So all of those are things that are within the realm of possibility for this session of Congress. And then the other piece is really taking advantage of the 2024 general elections and then trying to drive as much awareness as possible among federal candidates and elected officials that their constituents, both Puerto Ricans among the 6 million that live stateside and other allies that are not Puerto Ricans, but that are just other Americans that care about American democracy, to say, you know what, we care about our fellow U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico, and America needs to stop being colonial and stop the colony and let the people of Puerto Rico decide and make a choice, but offer them options that make sense, that are based on what is available under the U.S. Constitution. And that way, America can offer something that it can live with, and Puerto Ricans can choose what is it that we want for our future. And that, I think, is the greatest opportunity that we have in 2024.
I couldn't agree more, and that's why we have to make sure that we keep pushing forward, keep moving those wheels of progress forward to make sure that the Congress, that even us advocates, don't become complacent with the victories that we've had, significant victories, because there's more to come ahead. And I'm hopeful for this year that there will be progress on this issue, and we will finally move the ball forward, move the issue forward to the point that it's not just something to push back on the naysayers that always say that nothing's going to happen, Congress doesn't care, there's not this. It's time and time again we've seen how they've always said, it's not going to pass the House. Oh, it's not going to have bipartisan support. Oh, it's not going to be introduced in the Senate. Oh, it's not going to get that much support in the Senate, and then it gets historic support. Time and time again, the naysayers keep getting proven wrong, and then they just move the goalposts another 10 yards. And it's fine, but I still have that hope that change is coming this year.
No, definitely. And I think that's why it's so important to have an informed audience base and supporters, because the more you're aware that irrespective of all the naysayers that are saying this isn't going anywhere, nothing's going to happen, the more you're able to see the incremental progress that we're making, the more power you realize that each of us have. Me in the role that I play, but also you in the role that you play, whether it's going to pr51st.com and sending a message to your member of Congress, whether it's submitting a video for our Voices of Statehood initiative, or participating as part of the Puerto Rico Statehood Action Network, or coming to D.C. and being part of one of the congressional visits and D.C. fly-ins and meeting with your member of Congress, or going to your district office and meeting with the district office staff. All of us have the power to do something to advance this issue. And the more we realize that we have that power and then use it, the more we can actually continue to see the progress take place and build the momentum, so that when the right window of opportunity happens in Congress, we can actually get this ball down the field and score the touchdown of getting the bill passed and allowing the people of Puerto Rico to choose. And in the process, living up to America's core founding value of equality and government by consent of the governed.
Couldn't have said it better.
Well, we really want to thank everyone for listening in. We want to invite you to continue listening to this podcast. We've got a huge list of very exciting folks that we're inviting to participate as keynote guests in our podcast. So we recommend that you please hit like, hit subscribe, follow the podcast, and also visit our website for additional resources and content. And we look forward to sharing with you again in the future.